Tyrant by Xiran Jay Zhao is the embodiment of the meme mansplain, manipulate and murder, and in this video we are going to dig deep into this book. Almost 3 years ago I made a video on Iron Widow, the prequel to Heavenly Tyrant, and I called Iron Widow the embodiment of girl bossing, gaslighting and gatekeeping. And honestly, I am not disappointed or surprised that the author decided to fulfill my perfect video title by making Heavenly Tyrant a book that can be described by nothing other than manipulation, mansplaining, and murder. I mean, if I had to choose some other word to describe this book as, except for those three, I would say absurd. Because there is nothing in Heavenly Tyrant that even makes an inkling of sense. Heavenly Tyrant picks off right where Iron Widow left. That is, Wu Zetian has done the unthinkable and burned down the palace of the sages, and now she must do anything and everything to exert the power that she has fought so hard to gain, except only that she lacks all the tool and the support she requires to be powerful in the first place. In order to exert her own autonomy in a society that wants to crush her beneath their boots, she must ally herself with a man who has returned literally from the dead, King Zheng, an emperor of the past who revolutionized Huaxia and their society as they know it, because he was the man who united the 6 or more kingdoms that now make up Huaxia into one integrated nation. Now the two of them together must tackle not only their own derisive relationship but also the many snakes that threaten them at their court. Obviously, we have a lot of returning characters as well. While Li Shimin is presumed dead from the last novel, we do have one of the other love interests, Gao Yixi, returning, for the worst I might add. So this video I'll start by talking about the writing style of this novel. The issue with this novel is that the author is writing to attract an adult audience while being forced to write for a young adult audience while having the tone and diction of someone who is writing for a pre-teen audience. This is a book that comes off as juvenile and mean-spirited at times. The writing is so poor that sometimes you might wonder if you were reading a book that is trying to make the communist revolution happen in a fictional country inspired from China, or you're reading Dork Diaries where Nikki is writing about a day at her school that went horribly bad because of the mean girls present there. This isn't a revolutionary feminist work or a work that is groundbreaking in communist fantasy. This is a novel that has no faith in its reader and tries to explain even the basic concepts of communism to the reader because it has no idea how to pass its pages without bursting into long-winded monologues about how the characters are not really bad people but just misunderstood. Moreover, this book is very anachronistic. What I mean is that it uses words which makes no sense in the context that this book is written. If we are to assume Huaxia is a China-inspired world, then why are the people using words like bloke or jello shots? These words not only break the immersion that the reader has gained while reading the novel, but also make the world building seem really half-baked. It's almost like the author has no idea what they are really doing and is trying to do so much at the same time that it not only becomes chaotic, but it also becomes unsatisfactory for the reader to read this, because there is no place where the reader can connect the lines, immerse themselves in this world and be surprised. You know how we like to say that plot twists only make sense when there has been some foundation level work being done for them? Well, Xiran Jay Zhao has probably never heard of that saying, because they make no effort in laying the foundation or the groundwork for a good plot twist. They just like to surprise the reader for shock value, which is something that I personally despise. While we are on the subject of writing style, what I really disliked is how Wu Zetian's internal monologue has changed a lot from the previous book. Now, in the previous book, we did have long spiels of anger-induced feminism, but in this one, it's almost as if she has been mellowed down to a character that is a vague image of her former self. Now, this is a half-baked attempt of character development, but characters can only develop when you have given the reader an idea of what they need to be developing from or what they need to be developing into. When you discard the previously established ideas and try to spring on this entirely new form of development that has no groundwork behind it, it just seems odd and an insult to the reader's intelligence. Now, if you want 14 to 18-year-olds to read and enjoy this book, you need to understand that most of them do not enjoy reading a novel that has such little faith in the reader's intelligence or has such little faith in the reader's reading comprehension. To be very honest, this is a book that is so afraid of being misconstrued or misinterpreted that it over explains in the hopes of sounding intelligent, but rather just comes off as stupid. Apart from the writing style, let's move on to world building, which is an issue that I also had with Iron Widow. When I spoke of world building in Iron Widow, I told you how it hinges on people being familiar with movies such as Pacific Rim or Darling in the France. And if you're someone who has not watched any of those medias and does not have a familiarity with sci-fi, mechabots, etc. in the first place, you will feel like you're being thrust into a world which makes no sense. And that feeling of lack of familiarity continues into the second novel, which should not happen at all. In the second novel too, until like a good 30%, you have no idea how Huaxia works, how its economy is made, how such scientific developments have been made, and everything that goes on to make the society the way it is now. And because you have no idea of how bad the society can be, any reforms that Mr. Mao Zedong, I mean Mr. Qin Zheng and Wu Jitian try to implement together in order to uplift the conditions of the marginalized communities do not make it as important to the reader as they should be, because the reader has no previous idea of how bad the society was beforehand. Because to put it very simply, Wu Zitian is not a product of her society. She is someone who is extremely radicalized in spite of the fact that she grew up with little to no radical family members in an area where she had no formal education, where she only knew by example of how to treat people around her. In spite of that, there is a layer of suspension of disbelief that yes, perhaps Wu Zitian has a way of thinking that is different to her peers. But when the reader themselves has not been introduced to the world as a whole, no efforts to improve that world matter to the reader, because the world itself does not matter to the reader. For world building to be proper, you need to build the world first. You can't take someone to a house with only walls and tell them to imagine the rest of the house. You need to build the roof, the flooring, and the rooms of the house. And while speaking of the world building, this book is less of a sci-fi novel and more of the Communist Manifesto, right? So most of the pages of this book are filled by immersion-breaking monologues about laborism and communism. But if you take a deeper look, the world building does not itself allow for the term laborism or the term communism to even exist, because Huaxia is not just a nation. Huaxia is a planet, right? And we have been given no idea that any other nations except for Huaxia exist on this planet. There is no Europe, there is no Russia, there is no USA. So, in our world, on Earth that is, laborism as a term exists because of the Industrial Revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. And from the Industrial Revolutions came the labor unions and other forms of workers' rights committees, worker rights supporters, protests, landlords, calls for abolishment of tenancy, etc., etc., and mostly driven from colonialism as well. But if the United Kingdom does not exist as an entity, if Europe does not exist as an entity, then how can we come to the conclusion that something such as the Industrial Revolution did, something such as the term laborism came to existence, right? I'm not saying that Europe was the end all and be all of communism. One cannot imagine communism as it is in China without taking into account the influence that Europe had on it. I mean, the entire issue with Mao Zedong and his failures was driven by the fact that he did not want to follow Russian style communism or Stalinism. Instead wanted to stick to communism as Marx wrote it, right? So if you're going to write someone who is so much inspired from real life Chinese communism, then you also need to take into account what inspires Chinese communism. And when you don't have the root factors for inspiring communism in your sci-fi world, then where is all of it coming from? The world is so poorly made that you can't even tell if Huaxia is meant to be a country or if Huaxia is meant to be a planet. Moreover, Another issue that I had with the world building as a whole was that it wasn't subtle at all. Like every other chapter, there were discussions about how communism would fix all of their problems and how everything would be fixed by workers' unions, workers getting a lot of rights. And obviously, King Zheng is written to be as someone who is on the path of tyranny, right? So, in order to showcase that, we have random side characters who like serve 1 or 2 pages and immediately die in order to plant seeds of doubt into Jitian's mind about how King Zheng is not on the right path, and he is also someone who is rather a symbol of imperial violence on the working force rather than a true liberator and representative of the working force. Another thing that did strike me as odd though is how they are trying to implement such radical policy, but they do not face any of the consequences of such implementation. So, in our own world, if we take the example of Chinese communism under Mao Zedong in 1949, after he implemented his most radical policies, there were a lot of consequences. For example, the 100 Flowers campaign, when Mao Zedong wanted to bridge the gap between the party cadres and the intellectuals, he announced that let 100 school of thoughts contend and 100 flowers bloom, because he thought if he allowed free criticism there might be transparencies between what the party cadres did and what the intellectuals wanted to be done. But obviously that had huge backlash because intellectuals started criticizing the party cadres for their over enthusiasm. The intellectuals started criticizing Mao Zedong and the communist system of one party, and therefore the entire plan had to be called off. Moreover, the Great Famine, after communism was implemented and industry was reorganized on communist lines, China had one of the worst famines known in its history. Then, the Cultural Revolution, where so many innocents also lost their lives. Chinese communism was a very bumpy ride to China as we know it and China how it was under Mao Zedong. And that was very long run. It was a result of hundreds of people working together in order to rule a country that had never been ruled in the way that they were trying to rule it. And here we have King Zheng, who is a 20-year-old who has been dead for 200 years, Wu Zetian, an 18-year-old with no formal education, working together with the help of very few people who are truly loyal to them in order to establish a communist country on the lines of some sort of communism that should not exist in their world in the first place, without facing any major obstacles unless in the form of mob violence and death of innocents, which too is again explained away in the form that some things are just required for the revolution to work. And more often than not, all of these actions are portrayed in a very positive light by the narrative. And anyone who criticizes this is also someone who is not deemed in a positive light by the narrative. And that was what struck me as extremely odd throughout the novel. And it's at a point it just gets very annoying when I begin reading a sci-fi novel and the novel is filled with page upon pages description of workers' rights, tenancy legislation, etc. I mean, I get it. I love politics in sci-fi and fantasy. But if you have no way of properly embedding that politics into your novel, then perhaps you should rewrite and edit your novel and write something better. And moreover, since Iron Widow is a novel that is written for a young audience, it tries to dumb down its explanations. But then again, there is a scene where the characters use private property and common property as safe words. So the intention of the author is so mixed up. Do they want to write a gimmicky fantasy with just perfect amount of spice to bring in readers from all categories, or do they want to write a political fantasy with a lot of court intrigue and stakes? But due to this lack of clarity when it comes to intention, the author ends up writing a novel that was better off not written in the first place. Alright, when we've spoken about my central issue, let's move on to some more nitpicky things that I had. Character development, especially the character of Gao Yiji. Gao Yiji as a character, which I really liked and was interested in Iron Widow, has been reduced to a plot device in this novel. It's almost as if the author does not really know how to write any character other than Wu Zetian. Gao Yiji is a character who is shown to have suffered childhood sexual assault, and that sexual assault is used as a plot device in order to explain why he has to be strong or ruthless, rather than having any real impact on his character. For a novel that wants to showcase that it has a lot of radical thoughts about sexual assault and the sexual oppression of women, somehow it only treats sexual assault as a plot device that is brought in order to explain character development. And the reason why Gao Yiji's development into a ruthless, radical, political thinker makes no sense is majorly because we were not given a hint of it in the first book. If in the first book there was even a little foundation, even a little showcase of how ruthless Gao could be, then one might accept it and be like, oh, this was coming all along. But it wasn't coming all along, so it feels like a betrayal to the reader, and it almost feels like they are a different character altogether. Moreover, when it comes to juggling a female cast of characters, the issue with Xiran Jay Zhao's writing is that in the previous book they were too unfeminist. So in this book they fall into the trap of making feminism as simply all women getting along well. And though it makes an attempt at discussing how women's role in capitalist society works and how some women do oppress other women, it does a very poor job of doing so, because Wu Zetian herself is a person who is in a position to be oppressing other women. She is literally the empress of an imperial state that is built on violence and the forced assimilation of 6 different nations, right? So when there is not much critical thinking on this topic, then all of the other radicalization and polarized thoughts and political monologues fail to make an impact. This book also deals with surrogacy at a major portion, and one major plot point hinges on surrogacy. And then again, there is no discussion of how surrogacy is basically the exploitation and commodification of poor women's bodies and treating them as a vessel for carrying the children of the rich upper class women. Like Wu Zetian and King Zheng both respect the idea that Zetian does not want to carry the child herself and does not want to be a mother in the first place. But for them to have no such discussion about how ethical it is to use someone else's body in order to carry their child just feels a little off topic. Because if you're going to portray yourself as such radical communist thinkers, then why not think in all of those aspects, right? And I do realize that King Zheng is presented as the epitome of leftist men who still think themselves to be superior in comparison to women. But the point again stands, because this book only serves as a vehicle for the author to express their own political ideas and political motivations. There is no discussion regarding to something that the author might not themselves personally believe in, and that again I feel is like an easy way out of writing what you believe in and not exploring any of the other things that might be related to the very ideology that you are trying to preach. With character development, writing style, and world building out of the way, I think the major issue with Heavenly Tyrant is that it's trying to do too many things at the same time. There's a lot of discussion about feminism, there's a lot of discussion about communism, there's a lot of discussion about how imperialism works and how China in our society was driven apart majorly due to Western forces playing a role. But then again, these plot points are so stretched out that the author struggles to tie them all up together and deliver a proper ending. I'm almost surprised that Iron Widow was supposed to be a duology, because there is no way on earth that the author could in any way have delivered a satisfying ending in Heavenly Tyrant. And one of the most funny aspects of this book is that the real villains of this novel are Americans. That's literally the main plot point here. Americans are the real problem. Americans with their blue hair and pronouns and their fake liberalism are the real problem. And it's very funny to me, because even though it should have been very evident from the very beginning, I still could not see it coming. I did not realize that the real villain at the end would be the Americans we made along the way. And the issue with this is that this again is such an easy cop out. You wanted to have imperialism in your novel, there are much better ways to do it. You know, I could actually compare this book to the Poppy War, which has a lot of similarities. It is also a discussion about imperialism and oppression and how capitalism plays a force in the oppression of lower class workers, everything. And the Poppy Word is a very good way of discussing imperialism and capitalism without being too on the nose. Whereas Heavenly Tyrant here just invents a separate class of alien Americans in order to be the deus ex machina for the book to have its resolution. And that is so funny to me. I mean, I was laughing for a good 1 minute when I learned that the real villains were blue-haired Americans with pronouns who believe in capitalism and free market economies. And it's almost as if the author just does not know how to write metaphors. That's the entire problem with this novel. Everything is so literal and spelled out for the reader that it almost feels like you're being spoon fed the story itself. The story is made very palatable, very digestible, and I would not blame the author because I do know that there were a lot of issues in the editing and the publication of this book. And then again, reading comprehension has gone down in the past few years, so there is a risk of people willfully and ignorantly misinterpreting the novel. When you write a novel from the very beginning with the supposed criticism that you may be facing weighing heavy on your mind, then you write a novel that is so mean-spirited and so fixated on defending itself that it is not a novel that is worth reading. For me, Heavenly Tyrant was a 2.5 out of 5 stars because I have to admit that some part of it was enjoyable or entertaining to say the least. It is a bad novel with subpar character development, bad world building, and absolutely horrible prose. But then again, I enjoyed reading it, so for my personal enjoyment, it's like a 2 stars. But it is not a novel that I recommend reading, especially if you were someone who enjoyed Iron Widow. Then you would hate Heavenly Tyrant because this book just feels like fan service. It's almost like the author is trying to hit back at all the criticisms they faced about Iron Widow not being entirely feminist, or about Iron Widow not being too political, or Iron Widow not being realistic, and dial back and get stuck into this didactic, very preaching, on the nose manifesto of a novel that is better off not read at all. Very honest, if you really loved Iron Widow, try this novel out. Me personally, I will be reading the next book in this series just because I want to see how it ends and how they deal with the Americans. But overall, completely skippable, definitely suffers from second book syndrome, and overall, just an absurd and bad novel. That was my review for Heavenly Tyrant by Xiran Jay Zhao. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, share and subscribe because 90% of you who watch my videos are not subscribed at all. And do leave a comment because I love to discuss everything about Heavenly Tyrant and Iron Widow with you. So thank you for watching, be safe and bye bye.